Rome was able to expand so rapidly because of its economic strength. In this video, we'll be going over how Rome funded its expansion. As we all know, the Roman Empire expanded to cover most of the Mediterranean. It's hard for us today to wrap our minds around just how much land that actually is. The empire was about 5 million kilometers squared, which is about 2 million square miles. That's huge. And if you want to see just how big it was, here's a map of the Roman Empire at its largest extent compared to modern-day countries. So now, the question is, how did Rome afford to conquer all this land? Well, to answer that question, we're going to look at 3 ways Rome paid for its expansion. We'll be looking at taxation, infrastructure investment, and finally, compounding through conquest. So let's get started with taxation. The Roman Empire didn't have an income tax or a sales tax. Instead, they levied property taxes. So in order to pay taxes, you had to own property. Now, if you were a slave, you didn't have to pay taxes, nor did women. But if you were a free male landowner, then you would have to pay property tax based on what type of property you owned. For instance, if you owned agricultural land, you'd be taxed based on the number of acres you owned and the quality of the soil. If you had commercial property like a shop or an apartment building, you'd be taxed based on the rental value of the property. And lastly, if you owned a house in the city, you'd be taxed based on the size of the house and the value of the land it sat on. Now, there was also other taxes. For example, there was a wealth tax that everyone had to pay when they inherited property. So say you got an inheritance of 5,000 pieces of silver. You'd have to pay a tax on that full amount, even though you weren't getting 5,000 pieces of silver in your bank account. Instead, it was just a transfer of ownership from one person to another. Therefore, Rome saw that transaction as taxable income. Now, thankfully, they didn't have an estate tax, but instead they had something called the stamp duty. So essentially, whenever you bought something, whether it was food, clothing, or even art, you'd pay a tax on the transaction itself. And the tax rate varied depending on what you were buying. So the more expensive something was, the higher the tax rate. Then there was a tariff on imports. So, if you wanted to import wine from Greece or olives from North Africa, you'd have to pay a tax on those goods. Now, the reason Rome put these tariffs in place was to protect their local industries. So they made it more expensive to buy foreign goods. That way people would buy locally made goods instead. Then there was a tax on inheritances, which was kind of like a wealth tax. When you inherited property, you had to pay a percentage of its value to the government. And finally, there was a head tax on slaves. Every owner of a slave had to pay a fee to the government each year, so that was taxation. Now let's talk about infrastructure investment. Investing in infrastructure is one of the best ways to grow an economy. Look at any successful country in the world, and you'll see that they have invested heavily in infrastructure. Roads, bridges, airports, and public transit systems are all examples of infrastructure that help move people and goods throughout a country. And by investing in infrastructure, the government is creating jobs and stimulating the economy. This can lead to increased productivity and economic growth, which can then lead to more tax revenue for the government. So you can see why investing in infrastructure is so important. And Rome knew this very well. Let me tell you about the Appian Way. It was the first major road. Built by Rome, and it was built in 312 BCE. The road was 174 miles long, and it connected Rome to the city of Capua. The Appian Way was a monumental achievement. It allowed the Roman army to move troops and supplies quickly and easily, which helped them to conquer and hold on to their vast empire. The road also made it easier for merchants to transport goods, which helped to stimulate the economy. And it connected Rome to other parts of Italy, which helped to spread Roman culture and influence. The Appian Way was such a success that Rome continued to build roads throughout the empire. By the end of the empire, there were over 80,000 miles of roads in the Roman Empire. That's enough to circle the earth more than 3 times. All these roads helped to make the Roman Empire more prosperous and powerful. You see, Rome understood that by investing in infrastructure, they could make travel easier and safer. They could get their troops and supplies where they needed to go quickly. They could help merchants transport goods throughout the empire. They could connect their far-flung provinces to the center of the empire. And ultimately, they could grow the Roman economy and build up the power of the state. Now, let's talk about compounding through conquest. This basically means that Rome used its military victories to generate wealth. When Rome conquered new lands, they would take the wealth of the conquered people and use it to fund their military. This allowed them to keep their military strong, which in turn allowed them to conquer more land and take more wealth. It was a vicious cycle that helped Rome become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Let me explain further. When Rome conquered a new province, they would typically set up a system of direct rule. This meant that the province would be governed by a Roman official who was appointed by the emperor. The official would be responsible for collecting taxes from the province and for maintaining order. The taxes collected would go to the Roman treasury and be used to fund the military. And the military would then use its power to conquer more land, which in turn led to more wealth. Now there were some cases where Rome would allow the conquered people to govern themselves. But in these cases, Rome would still keep control of the province's finances. This way, they could make sure that the province was paying its taxes and that the money was being used to support the empire. For example, after defeating Carthage in the Punic Wars, Rome took control of vast amounts of territory in Spain, North Africa, and Sicily. These territories were highly productive and generated a lot of wealth for Rome. Rome then used this wealth to build up its military and navy, which allowed them to continue expanding. So you can see that Rome's compounding strategy worked very well for them. It allowed them to grow their empire quickly and easily, and it also allowed them to build up a strong military and navy. However, it's important to note that not everyone benefited from Rome's compounding strategy. The people who lived in the conquered territories often suffered greatly under Roman rule. Their lands were taken from them, and they were forced to pay high taxes to the Roman government. But despite the suffering of the conquered people, Rome's compounding strategy was a major factor in the success of the Roman Empire. Taxation, infrastructure, investment, and compounding through conquest are all strategies that any country can use to fund its growth. Taxation is, of course, the most straightforward. If a country needs money, it can simply raise taxes. However, this can lead to a decrease in economic activity as people and businesses have less money to spend. Infrastructure investment is another option. When a country invests in infrastructure, it is making an investment in its future. The benefits of this investment will not be seen immediately, but over time, the country will reap the rewards. Compounding through conquest is the least desirable option, but sometimes it may be the only option available. When a country uses this strategy, it is important to remember that it is not just the military that is being built up, but also the economy. By taking wealth from conquered peoples, Rome was able to build up its own economy and make its military even stronger. So which of these strategies do you think was the most important to Rome's success? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. As always, if you want to learn more about ancient history, check out my podcast where I take a humorous and light-hearted approach to learning about the past. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.